Welcome everyone to this policy exchange event on competition policies. We've got a great panel ready for you today, and I'm just going to say a few words. I'm Juliet Samuel. I'm a columnist at the Telegraph. I'm going to stand up there. So competition policy is something that's not very sexy to normal people. But sorry to say, and yet we have a full room here today, and the reason for that, I think,
there's a lot of abnormal people about, and welcome.
That could be one reason, but I think another reason may be that a lot of people, maybe on the right or capitalist supporters, perhaps feel that after the last election we've come back from a near-death experience politically in this country, and there was a lot of talk over the last few years, since the financial crisis really, about how the free markets have died and how people have lost their faith in capitalism, and it isn't really the best who get ahead anymore, it's just the biggest or the most cronyistic. And so beneath the technicalities of competition policies are actually very big ideas. And I think on the right, particularly, some of the people who are now in government have turned towards competition policy as one of the things that is going to save them or save capitalism from itself and prevent endless concentration, prevent the accumulation of power to a degree that ordinary people are perhaps losing faith in markets. So, and in fact, behind that premise, I think are some interesting questions as to whether that is happening. Is that just an impression? In what areas is it happening? Because we typically associate competition policy with areas like supermarkets or small business supply. But is it in fact happening in areas that are somewhat more obscure, like online data and advertising? And where is it that economic value is actually being hoarded, if it is being hoarded, and what are all the knock-on effects from that? So I would say that the Competition and Markets Authority, especially as we leave the EU, with all of the regulatory freedom that the government is promising that it will negotiate and that it will not give up on, the CMA has a huge job in answering those questions and telling us exactly how our markets are going to look. Are they broken? And if they are broken, how are we going to fix them? And especially, how are we going to fix them just being one corner of the global economy and certainly not home to the biggest part of the problem in terms of data or tech? And so those are some of the questions that I'm hoping some of our panelists are going to answer. Just a small task for them this morning. And we're going to kick off with Lord Tyrie, who is a familiar face around Westminster, especially to those of us who, like I did, used to cover banking. And we used to go along to the Treasury Select Committee, which Lord Tyrie used to chair when he was an MP until 2017. And we knew that finally there we might get some answers from some of the bank executives. And it was probably the only time we would. So he's going to kick off with a few words.
Well, thank you very much. It's a very interesting set of opening remarks, and I don't only there refer to the suggestion that we're all oddballs. We certainly are going to get our day in the sun, I think, as a consequence of the transformations that are taking place in markets right now. Before I say anything about that, of course, this is primarily a discussion about what's happening in the CMA in response to those changes. I've heard it said there's a cultural revolution going on in Whitehall right now, and the newspapers are telling us that half of Whitehall's for the chop. I don't know whether that's true, but we're not here talking about revolution to competition policy or the CMA. We're talking about reform. And so we're not only oddballs, but we're dull oddballs as well. Even so, some of the changes that we're proposing, taken together, I think, constitute quite fundamental reform of the institution and of the way we conduct competition policy and consumer protection in the UK. We are a small, dynamic government department. Institutionally, we're not going to wait for events to change us. We are and have been probably for 2 years at least, predating me, working out how to change and improve in response to events in the global markets to which you were just alluding a moment ago. We need to have, I think, as our starting point, what those events are and how people perceive us in response to it. The image, and to some degree the reality of a competition authority, is of a high-powered, somewhat remote group of technocrats securing free markets in the public interest. Most jurisdictions have competition frameworks. They're designed to entrench free enterprise. Most of them delegate decisions to independent authorities. That's the consensus, that they should be independent. But that consensus is now at risk of breaking down, and I think there's plenty of evidence for that. There's Trump out there with America first. There are the demands of the Gilets jaunes. There are signs of a more interventionist industrial policy in the EU. The received wisdom of the decades that followed the collapse of communism, that competitive markets, sound money, and openness to international trade are the surest route to prosperity, is now being challenged. And so too are the institutions like us that support those objectives. Independent central banks and regulators and other public authorities are under attack for not responding vigorously enough, for their lack of accountability. They, I think, can no longer take their legitimacy or their independence for granted. And competition authorities are certainly in the frame for this kind of criticism, and perhaps for good reason. The evidence is getting stronger that markets are not working as they should, and certainly not as the public have a right to expect. For instance, the Bank of England has recently concluded that listed firms' average markups have risen from 20% in 1987 to 60% 30 years later. And over the last 20 years, the turnover share, so a measure of concentration, the turnover share of the UK's 100 largest businesses has risen from 21% to 28%. These trends are being exacerbated by the dynamism and innovation of the modern global economy. The rise of the digital economy is an important part of that. Of course, this massively increases choice and competition, but it's excluding many people altogether, and it's also rendering previously competent, confident and capable consumers, that's you and me, as we thought we were, much more vulnerable to getting bad deals and poor service online. And there are heads nodding in the audience as I say that. So we've got problems there growing in markets for most competition authorities around the world. And in a moment, we'll be hearing from Bill Kovacic, immediately to my right here now, one of the world's leading authorities on this subject, who we're very lucky to have sitting on our board, the former head of the US Federal Trade Commission, who will discuss that point a little later on. So if we really do have a problem, how should the CMA be responding? In my view, and I've set this out elsewhere in some detail, doing nothing really isn't an option, nor is merely restating the merits of the current framework of independence strong as the case may be. It seems to me that the most meaningful way to restore confidence in markets is to make them work better. Now, most of the public won't have even heard of the CMA, but in my view, that's a weakness, not a strength. If we don't do our bit to help restore confidence in markets, the independent competition and consumer protection framework in the UK, the whole framework may be threatened, and along with it, many of the welfare gains it currently produces. One possible response is to compromise independence somewhat, to place the authority for individual decisions on competition matters in the hands of those who are directly accountable to the electorate. That is, to compromise in some way what's often called operational independence. It's all too easily forgotten that the independence currently enjoyed in the UK and all the benefits that come with it is only around 20 years old. It's quite recent. For nearly half a century after the war, in one way or another, senior ministers took most of these key decisions on whether, for example, to make an antitrust reference to the MMC or to block a merger. Any decision on independence, of course, is for ministers and right at the top of government, and that's well beyond my pay grade. It's always been well beyond my pay grade. But I will make one observation about it. In my view, if competition policy was returned to direct ministerial control, even if it started well, it might end up responding to the organised, concentrated calls of the few, rather than the dispersed and muffled voice of the many, who we're there to represent. And it could hand even more power to the large number of corporate lobbyists and vested interests that cluster around competition and consumer issues. It seems to me that a much better response is for us to get closer to consumers. I joined an institution under Andrea's leadership on the far right, which was already responding in this way. He's done a great job in turning the CMA already into a different institution from one that was there only a couple of years ago. The evidence is everywhere. The CMA is tougher on mergers. It's more active to protect consumers in online markets. It's more active to reform markets that matter to consumers, like care homes and funerals. And it's more robust in making recommendations to government, where the CMA feels that it institutionally is not best placed to act. And last year, the CMA made, which was also an initiative for the CMA, made some wide-ranging proposals for changes and improvements to the legal framework of competition and consumer policy as a whole. In a nutshell, we're asking for new statutory duties to be imposed on the CMA, duties to put the consumer first, and a duty to act swiftly when things go wrong. Institutions don't often leap to have new duties put on them, but that seems to be a good starting point, and it, institutionally, I think would be good for us. And of course, we'll need the powers to back up those duties to enable us to do the job. Powers to act earlier and more robustly to promote competition, and to fine companies that treat consumers unfairly. These statutory changes will be essential, in my view, if we're to meet public expectations. Those are the expectations, of course, that have triggered the challenge to the consensus that's breaking out everywhere in Western democracies, both sides of the Atlantic, the challenge to the consensus that I described at the start of my remarks. So we need that legislation. But in the meantime, I think we can ask ourselves how we can do better. And that's exactly what we've been doing institutionally. Do better with the powers that we've already got. We've concluded that we can take reform of ourselves further even without statutory change. And we can do that in at least three ways. First, we can listen more closely to consumers and spend more time identifying what really matters most to them. And you'll be hearing shortly from James Plunkett on how we're going to work more closely with the CAB, with citizens' advice. They're on the front line of consumer detriment. I saw that for myself when I was an MP for 20 years. I saw how valuable the CAB is as an institution locally, right at the grassroots, doing outstanding work to help those often most affected by detriment going about their daily lives and most vulnerable to exploitation and rip-offs. The second thing we can do is we can review how we decide which cases to investigate and which tools to deploy. And we can do more to explain the reasons for our choices and how they will really benefit consumers. How we take our decisions is something that we are now going to review internally. And the third thing that we can do is we can become much more visible and vocal in advocating reforms and, if necessary, legislation on key microeconomic questions of the day, on the forces shaping markets and the consumer's experience of them, on where government policy should be going, advocacy about the legislative framework, not only for ourselves, but elsewhere, and on business conduct. That in itself will amount to a substantial change. And with the statutory reforms that we've already published, the CMA can and will become a much more effective competition and consumer authority than hitherto. It will be much better equipped to secure the opportunities and to address the challenges of being a standalone regulator outside the EU. And in our view, it will be able much better to cope with the pace of change in markets and able to act much more quickly to protect consumers against new and emerging forms of detriment. That's what we're determined as an institution to deliver, and I'll hand over to Andrea now to describe in more detail what we're doing and planning and those three main areas I described a moment ago. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew. So I will try to add a bit of context and detail to some of the points Andrew made. So our mission, which was stated in 2014, is to make markets work in the interest of consumers, businesses, and the economy. And that clearly still stands. But we've been reflecting, and will continue to reflect on what this means in practice. So the CMA is now 6 years old. But the regime for which we are responsible is a mix of legislation that dates back 2 decades. Like any public authority, we are the product of the legislation that established us, combined with our own history and culture as an organization. We're also the product of the 2 organizations that preceded us. The Office of Fair Trading was well recognized, in many ways more than we are, thought about problems in the round, was brimming with good ideas, but at times was perceived to be less successful in the follow-through on cases. The Competition Commission was designed as a quasi-judicial institution. It was very effective in fulfilling that remit, but was seen by stakeholders as quite remote. When we merged the 2 in 2014, we tried to pick the best of both, but in particular, we focused very much on the implementation, on delivering cases, which was what stakeholders were asking us to do. And that's our inheritance. And like many other public bodies, in many ways, we reflect those compromises. And this is a system that, in many ways, is difficult sometimes for us to explain to non-experts. And a taxpayer-funded system that is hard to explain, to some extent, brings challenges with it. So we shouldn't be surprised that many consumers are unaware of us or, to some extent, confused about what we do or what we stand for. So today I'm bringing together 3 things: the public reflections on the system, the improvements we've made, and some of the new improvements, and Andrew mentioned some of them. So a year ago, we reflected publicly on the changes in legislation that we felt are needed for the system to develop and evolve. to address some of these challenges. And this was the letter that Andrea addressed to the then Secretary of State, Greg Clark. More recently, we've been reflecting on what we can do without changes in the legal framework, so very much in parallel to that exercise, how we can improve our accountability, our accessibility, our ability to respond to challenges. So since I became the chief executive in 2016, we have made a number of changes in these areas to deliver more for consumers. And I will just mention a few things we've done. So one is to focus on director disqualification, which we think is very important to bring individual accountability. And that's certainly something we pick up in cases, the fact that individuals are possibly at risk for disqualification if the companies they are involved in breach competition law, particularly for cartel cases. And we have secured the disqualification of 13 directors over the last couple of years in 5 different cases. We've also managed to obtain money back for vulnerable consumers in care homes. We stamped out bad practices in a number of online sectors, like the gambling sector. We work with James and some of his colleagues to deal with sort of loyalty penalties in a number of core regulated sectors, like telecoms and financial services. And we have tried to make sure that consumers are protected with shopping online, whether booking a hotel room, hiring cars, or buying concert tickets. And we've been trying to get ourselves to the forefront on digital issues. We have an ongoing online platform market study, which has been reasonably impactful so far. We have a large data unit with data scientists, data engineers, emerging technology experts, and behavioral scientists. We are leveraging their expertise to tackle emerging problems like fake online reviews, the manipulation of the online environment to steer consumer choices, and algorithms used by businesses that work against consumers' interest. And these algorithms affect the price all of us pay every day for petrol, for holidays, for tickets, for everything we do. And to some extent, whenever we engage with digital marketplaces, be it Amazon or eBay, this is all driven by algorithms. We've been quite active in our merger control work. We've protected people like us from price increase in areas like supermarkets, pubs, again, petrol prices. We've worked on cartels. We've stopped companies from cheating by fixing prices, particularly in the construction industry recently. And as a number of you are aware of, we have a fairly large program of investigations against pharmaceutical companies that have been essentially unfairly extracting money from the NHS. And we have a number of cases active and a number of cases going through litigation at the moment. And recently, as you know, as you would expect, we spent quite a lot of time preparing for exit from the European Union at the end of the year, which is going to be fairly significant for the CMA. So I just want to say a bit more about the 3 themes that Andrew mentioned. So the first area is what we call know more, understand better. And what we're trying to do is deepen our understanding of how existing markets are changing and of consumers' experiences and concerns. So to ensure that we're delivering for people around the UK, we need to be confident we know what they want as consumers and what their concerns are. And this is particularly the case for vulnerable consumers. We all know that there are a number of characteristics, be it age, socioeconomic status, education status, disability, that leave consumers vulnerable to bad deals or poor service. So we've always, of course, worked on behalf of consumers, but we're trying hard now to shift the culture of the CMA to sharpen our focus on what matters to consumers. So it's with this aim in mind that we started a project to assess the state of competition in markets across the UK. This is something that was explicitly asked of us by the then Chancellor and Secretary of State a few weeks ago. And we've already been thinking about these issues for some time, and we'll produce an initial report in the summer. So our work on the state of competition will give us the numerical and technical evidence we need, but we also need the deeper knowledge we can gain by understanding and sharing in a variety of consumers' experiences. We really need to understand what it means when consumers get exploited by unscrupulous suppliers. We need to see through the eyes of consumers the confusion that markets can represent for some of them, some of the time. So that's why we'll be working with Citizens Advice, with James and his colleagues, to try to put our CMA staff in close contact with local citizens advice and contact centers to really understand firsthand the experience that different demographics, different groups of consumers face. This engagement, we believe, will really bolster the CMA's role as a repository of microeconomic expertise so that our interventions are based on understanding how people actually behave and why, in addition to the challenges they face every day in navigating markets. That's why we're recently set up and are currently hiring for a behavioral hub, which will focus on economics, data science, and behavioral sciences to enhance our understanding of consumer issues. Our new data and technology insight team, which is also part of the data unit, is working on understanding the innovation ecosystem. We're looking to the future to understand how markets and firms are changing in light of developments in data and technology. The second area Andrew mentioned is the sort of transparency point, is explaining the choices we make. I mean, obviously, we are quite transparent by international standards. We are, you can read our annual plan, you can read our annual report, and we respond to MPs' letters, to various letters as complaints we receive about markets that don't work. So the challenge for ourselves is to go further and learn from, some of the best sector regulators, like, the FCA, Ofcom, Ofgem, who are deeply involved in granular discussions around the countries right now to understand how their work impacts different demographics. And that's the exercise we're going to launch at the beginning of April with our new annual plan. We're trying to do the same. It's not easy to do exactly what sector regulators do because, in a sense, we're dealing with the whole of the general economy. So we have to think about priorities. But we think we can do more than what we're doing at the moment. The third area is what we call being more visible and more vocal. And the idea is to effect change through speaking up publicly as well as through enforcement. So obviously we always had both an enforcement angle and an advocacy angle. This is in legislation. But when we started the CMA, we focused heavily on enforcement. We focused heavily on delivering cases. The reality of delivering cases under the Competition Act or consumer protection is months and years of investigations by us and quite frequently a follow-on through the courts. And this is the right way to achieve impact. The risk is that for consumers, there is significant time lag from when they experience problems, they experience issues, and when essentially there is a sense of justice. And just to give you an example, we had a case in pharmaceuticals where GlaxoSmithKline paid some potential competitors not to enter the market, which we believe was illegal. And we fined GlaxoSmithKline in 2016 £37 million plus £8 million for some of the generic would-be competitors. That case was appealed domestically at the Competition Appeals Tribunal, and some of the questions of law were then referred from the tribunal to the European Court of Justice. And a judgment came out a few weeks ago from the European Court of Justice, which was very favorable to our case. The case now has to go back to the Competition Appeals Tribunal and hopefully and eventually will finish at some point this year. But you can imagine for the NHS and for consumers, the time lag from the actual events to the end of our investigation and the end of the litigation is very significant. And in this case, the restitution will be to the NHS, and to some extent the NHS eventually will get the money and it's going to be fine. But you can imagine individual consumers not being in the same place. So we want to focus on enforcing effectively, but we also want to try to speak up publicly and try to leverage the knowledge and information we acquire during investigations to try to fix things more promptly for consumers. And we will try, where appropriate, to use roundtables, to try to use all the powers available to us to fix things quickly and promptly alongside enforcement. So we look at every possible problem in the round, trying to work out the most effective and efficient answer. So sometimes the answer might be to come down hard on individuals or companies, but sometimes it might be advocacy to government. And obviously, we have a very important mergers function, and that's a very important area where we can try to protect consumers when blocking a merger would be the right thing to do. So we'll try to do that, and in the meantime, we'll also try to use every opportunity available to us, including events like today, to try to explain why consumers benefit from well-functioning markets. Our view is that as long as the right protections are in place for consumers, dynamic competition is the way that all of us, can get better products and services over time. So how will we look different in future? Now, neither I nor Andrea, I guess, can pretend that we can address all of these challenges ourselves. Many of these challenges are the result of much wider forces. And even within our remit, much of what we do is still limited by the legislative framework. That's why it's so important for us to try to achieve some of these changes alongside what we can do ourselves. Nor should we pretend that any changes can happen overnight and you can see things to be very different tomorrow. And in many ways, this is really one of the merits of the system. This is not a system which is driven by snap judgments. Everything we do is driven by evidence, by investigations, and obviously very significant rights of defense. Nor should we pretend that we're aiming for a dramatic upheaval or something that's completely different from what you have seen before. There are, after all, so many ways of delivering against a set of duties that are defined in statute. So what we're trying to do is to try to build on the best of the CMA, building on the best bits of our inheritance, and building on everything we have achieved so far. So where we can do our bit, we'll do so. Where we can suggest that others are better placed, be it government or regulators, we'll do it very much in a spirit of partnership, which I think is very much what we've been trying to do over the last few years. Consumers, we believe, should see a difference, and increasingly so. I think consumers and consumer representatives like James should see us listening more carefully to their concerns. And I think they should see us as creating opportunities for them to tell us what they think. They should see us helping the government work out how to fix the big systemic problems in markets so it's easier for them to find their way to the right services. They should see us improving outcomes in the markets that matter most to them. I think our task is to earn the trust, confidence, and recognition of consumers, to let them know that essentially we are on their side. Now, the observers that are closer to our work, the lawyers, economists working for the companies engaged with us, I think we really see no difference in terms of our determination to get to the right answer based on the evidence. This is very much in our DNA. It's a very strong feature of the system. But at the same time, I think they should see us as a more vocal, more visible institution on behalf of consumers. So that's our agenda for the 2020s. And obviously, we're very happy to hear of any good ideas that people here and in other places have for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're now going to hear from Professor Kovacic, hopefully I pronounced that right, who is a director at the CMA and was at the Federal Trade Commission in the US.
Thank you, Juliet. Thank you to Policy Exchange. Thank you, Andrew and Andrea, for the opportunity to participate in this program. When I finished university a little while ago, in the late 70s, I had a conversation with my advisor who asked me, what do you mean to do with your law degree? And I said, I'd like to have a career in international competition law. And he shook his head with evident sadness and said, I could never recommend that you go into a field that will never be important. And in 1978, that was not a foolish recommendation. There were approximately 20 jurisdictions that had competition laws. If we come forward to the late 80s, the number goes up to about 30. Today, it's 130. 100 new regimes in the last 30 years. An extraordinary policy development. What I'd like to offer is a comparative perspective on some of the themes that both Andrew and Andrea have developed today, to talk about where we stand in the larger universe and the challenges that competition agencies globally face. Let me highlight three universal challenges, perhaps not faced with the same intensity by every nation, but I'd suggest almost every significant jurisdiction faces these in one way or another. First challenge, the challenge of commercial dynamism. From the beginning of competition law in North America in the late 19th century, Canada first in 1889, the US second in 1890, there's been a recurring critique that competition law is badly suited to deal with dynamic industries. First, you don't know enough to do the job well. Second, you're too slow. Third, when you act, it's ineffective. In effect, many commentators, indeed one at an earlier age, said that competition law is like riding a bicycle to catch up with an automobile. It's not a fair fight. It's an earnest effort, but it's ultimately futile. So one is, how do you address and stay in touch with the developments that are so well known to us, especially in information technology? The second critique deals with the ambivalence of citizens about large firms and about the market system generally. Many citizens are schizophrenic. On the one hand, they like what they get in many instances as purchasers. They enjoy competition. But when they look at large business enterprises, they're not so sure. And in many jurisdictions, governments have essentially formed a political bargain with their citizens. And the bargain goes like this. We will tolerate the development, we'll encourage the development of markets, we'll rely on markets as the pillars of the economy. And indeed, we will welcome the development of large enterprises that become large because of their skill, their industry, their foresight. But we will create robust regulatory mechanisms to ensure that private initiative serves larger social ends. That's the basic political bargain, to cure the ambivalence. I'd say that bargain has frayed. And the perception of it, especially since 2008, where I think we still taste the bitter residue of the financial collapse, is a widespread concern in many countries. I'd say the conflagration is greatest in the United States right now, which is in the face of an extraordinary economic and political upheaval. Say hello to President Sanders. Imagine what that will do in many ways. That is not simply a far-fetched possibility. That can happen. It's an indication of the turmoil that's taking place now. The concern that citizens are no longer protected effectively, that governments have failed in their duty to provide the requisite regulatory frameworks, and as a consequence, you have tremendous upheaval, a loss of civic trust, and a sense that markets don't work, with the possibility that we replace markets with much more intrusive forms of regulatory oversight, or simply put the government back in the business directly of owning and operating productive assets. Third challenge. It's the role and relationship of competition agencies to the political process. A lot of pressure in many jurisdictions today for direct intervention. Some heads of state speak openly to competition agencies about specific outcomes that they wish to see take place. And some of these officials are quite powerful, and they have the capacity through direct political control to change outcomes in the review of matters such as mergers. On the one hand, there's a broad recognition that a competition authority, to be legitimate, must have autonomy with respect to key functions, such as the decision to prosecute, the decision about whom to investigate, and what sanctions to seek. If you don't have a measure of independence there, you're simply an extension of the political process where, on a bad day, elected officials reward their friends and punish their enemies. And competition law is simply another device to do that. But complete insulation would not be acceptable either. Can you imagine a nation giving an institution lots of money and lots of power, but never asking it to account for its political choices, for its policy choices, for its program? Unimaginable. And it also wouldn't be effective. How could you get the legislative reforms that Andrew and Andrea have referred to if you're not having a continuing conversation with your legislature and with ministers? Couldn't be done. So there are trade-offs. How do you maintain the requisite autonomy, but maintain the legitimacy that shows that you're a good steward for the resources you have, and how do you be effective in using those? Three challenges universally faced. How to respond to them. I echo Andrew's comment that you can't respond simply by standing still and doing nothing and watching things go by. There's a blaze out there. Again, I think it's more intense in North America, but it's coming this way too. It's a concern that regulatory policy has been desperately inadequate, the citizens are not being well served, and as a consequence, a basic rethink of the relationship of the government to the market has to be reconsidered. So, what the program, I think, that's been identified has great promise to address the three challenges that I mentioned before. What's important about it is that these are things that the CMA can do right now. In many countries, you see two elements of the reform package. One is legislation. If you wait for Mr. Godot to deliver the legislation, maybe he comes, maybe he doesn't, but in many instances, he doesn't show up, and you wait. So the other strategy is what can you do with what you have? And what's impressive to me about this approach is that it picks what's worked well as prototypes within the United Kingdom, and it adopts good practices from other jurisdictions. My view in general is that if you take these three ingredients and pursue them the way that Andrea and Andrew have suggested, it's a state-of-the-art competition regime. You take a uniquely effective set of existing policy tools and you apply them more effectively. Perfectly? Probably not. This is an exercise carried out by human beings, and it is, as academics say, a work in progress, but I'd have a great deal of confidence that this would place the United Kingdom exactly in the front ranks of institutions that are trying a variety of approaches to address these considerations. A couple of closing comments about what it does. Building knowledge, the investment in knowledge puts you in a better position to deal with the knowledge problem I identified, much better, by enlisting co-producers, such as citizens' advice, to assist you in the effort to become wiser, and it puts you in a position to pick smarter techniques for addressing a phenomena that have been addressed. It's important because this represents an investment. Public officials often face a tension between whether to invest or consume. Consume in the form of bringing cases that draw more attention, or invest in knowledge, R&D, that makes future intervention more effective. What's so important to me is the commitment here to invest as a way of building the good cases and the good programs in the future. Second, the disclosure ingredient has the very valuable element of providing legitimacy. In effect, the agency asks, I want autonomy for certain decisions, but I will be accountable for policy choices made. I'll explain what I did and why I did it more clearly. That's an important way of resolving the tension between autonomy and independence and building public confidence, giving the public confidence that the regulatory bargain indeed is in place and serves them well, and to take existing measures and to do them still better. The advocacy ingredient has a similar approach. More confidence about the integrity of the political bargain, and it will be advocacy that is based on the stronger body of knowledge that's acquired over time. Advocacy without knowledge isn't particularly useful. Advocacy without a sound idea of where to go isn't helpful. If you don't know where you're going faster doesn't help very much. So the knowledge base provides a basis for giving legislators and other policymakers a confident idea about where to go and how to do it. Let me finish with a final point about the international context. With Brexit, and indeed even before Brexit, the UK occupies a special position to advance in a uniquely influential role internationally. What's happened? The US has retreated. Pains me to say it, but the US does not play effectively in international councils about competition law. Trying to carry out some reforms, the election could change things dramatically, but there's a huge vacuum now, a massive vacuum. The European Union is important. It doesn't have the same policy tools that the United Kingdom does, especially the research and development function that we have been referring to and the entire markets regime. What does that mean? It means that there is a distinctive possibility to play the leading, if not the leading role in policy development. It won't happen because economic significance dictates whether the nation should do. It will happen through persuasion. This is a role in many ways that the CMA, the Competition Commission, and the OFT have played effectively in the past. That role is there to be had today. These kinds of adjustments, better knowledge, better disclosure, better advocacy, put the CMA in a position to take tools it already has and indeed to become, if not the leader in international competition policy thinking, certainly second to none in that process.
Thank you very much. We're now going to hear from Dr. James Plunkett at the Citizens Advice Bureau, and he was previously at the Resolution Foundation and worked in Number 10.
I'm not a doctor, but I'll take that. That's welcome. So start by thanking colleagues from the CMA. We have a very collaborative relationship, but often also challenging relationship with the CMA, which is, I think, as it should be, and look forward to kind of deepening that partnership with some of the measures that Andrea has set out today. I guess Bill zoomed out quite far and talked about the big picture, and I'm going to zoom right back in and talk about consumers, and that's often my role in these kinds of debates and events, is to bring the consumer into the room. I spend my life, as we all do at Citizens Advice, in two kinds of quite different settings that I'm tempted to call abnormal and normal now after the introduction. So kind of abnormal settings like this, where we're talking about regulatory policy among lawyers, economists, and other policy experts, and then settings on the front line of consumer detriment in our local bureau, giving advice to people over the phone, as well, giving advice to often very vulnerable people that are experiencing problems in markets. We help a very large number of people every year, so we think around 29 million unique users of our online advice every year, and about 2.9 million face-to-face or over the phone. So there's a very large data set there that essentially shows us live what kind of detriment is being experienced by people, including in their interactions with the state, but also in their interactions with consumer markets. I think the fair kind of point to make there is that over the last decade, there's been quite an uncomfortable and sometimes jarring gap between those two different environments. And for myself, I often spend my time in discussion with regulatory policymakers and others, where the mood was kind of that markets broadly are working quite well, that outcomes are pretty good, that if anything, the problem, frankly, is consumers, and if anything, they should engage a bit more and should change their behaviour. And at most, tweaks were needed to the regulatory regime. And then, of course, we'd switch to the front line where things felt incredibly different, and people, again, often vulnerable people, were experiencing quite self-evident injustices and being ripped off in some ways that felt quite obvious and quite kind of self-explanatory, and in ways that felt unsustainable often. So that's one of the reasons we launched our super complaint on the loyalty penalty. The loyalty penalty seemed to us one manifestation of that kind of gap between the problems people were experiencing and the kind of satisfactoriness of the solutions from regulators and others. An example of a kind of very long-running problem to some of the points made about the slowness of the system to respond. People have been ripped off for many years after being loyal to the current provider they're with. Those penalties they're paying are very large in many cases. Vulnerable people pay much more, and yet regulators seem to be quite slow to respond to that seemingly quite sort of self-evident problem. It seems to us, I guess, quite urgent that the system, the regulatory regime, responds to that kind of problem. And I thought I'd just give three stories, I guess, or facts that bring that to life a bit for me. The first is really a story that speaks to that point of the exploitation of human behaviour. So last year I sat in on an advice session with an elderly woman who had come to us struggling with money. She'd got into debt. She knew more than anyone in this room, frankly, about her weekly shopping bill, and she could tell us to the penny the price of milk, bread, the supermarket she went to. Her hairdresser hadn't raised the price for 10 years. She said that very proudly. We had to break it to her that her insurance company was ripping her off by £600 a year, which wiped out all of that good choices she was making in other markets, and her face dropped, as you'll appreciate, when she heard that news. That seems to me a perfect example of the exploitation of human behaviour. It's an example of a market that ostensibly on the face of it feels very competitive. Insurance is fiercely competitive when it comes to the acquisition prices that we all pay, and yet very clearly there was some kind of failure going on there, and I would call that a behavioural market failure, if you like, rather than a kind of classically conceived market failure. And that seems to us a big deal because those people are being ripped off even now. And in a sense, what was happening there was the competition itself was taking place over who could most cleverly rip off that woman. That was what insurance companies were innovating on, is who could design the auto renewal process most cleverly so that people didn't notice that their price had gone up. And that is not competition working well. Second story is about the power of technology, really. So we had a phone call from a bank last year. I won't name them, but they phoned us to ask how they might put rules around their algorithms, because they had seen their algorithm that helped them make loan decisions, churning out decisions they didn't understand themselves. And they were asking us essentially for parenting tips as to how should they guide their algorithms and their staff about what is fair and what is not fair when it comes to using an algorithm, machine learning and AI and so on to make decisions that affect consumers. That's a tough question, and we don't know the answer, and I'm not sure anyone yet knows the answer. It seems to me there are different views on the extent of Some of these practices, price discrimination was mentioned earlier, the use of algorithmic decision making. Seems to me no one yet knows quite how we should go about regulating these practices, but it certainly seems that technology is giving companies new ways to identify consumers who might be exploited, and new ways then to manipulate those consumers to make them disengage, for example, from markets, so that they can then be exploited with higher prices. And that seems to me, again, quite a big deal that the system needs to respond to. Final point is about power, really, in politics. So this is a story from our work on energy. We have a role representing consumers in the energy market, and we, as part of that, represent consumers in price settlements, which are the, as many people will know, the big negotiations over how much energy networks can charge consumers for the pipes and the wires that distribute energy. We found out through a lot of hard work that consumers had paid £7.5 billion too much in the previous price settlement in the energy market. Did some very good work with colleagues at Ofgem to try and put that right in the next price settlement. That was essentially excess profit that companies had made over and above the acceptable level of profits, and people had paid that money to unnecessarily, more than they needed to. Some admirable companies gave some of that money back, most pocketed it. In the next negotiations, and this is the fact that stuck in my mind, energy networks obviously submit a lot of evidence to try and back up their argument, their side of the story. Some submitted as much as 2,000 pages of evidence for one company. When you add up the evidence submitted by industry in that one negotiation, it would add up to reading every Harry Potter book 4 times just to read the submissions from the energy networks. Now, we don't have time to read them. How on earth do we and other organisations hope to represent consumers in negotiations like that? And I would make a similar point about the appeals process when it comes to competition decisions, as we've heard, and we all know what happens when the expensive lawyers and lobbyists then come in on the back of those kind of decisions. And that seems to us to reflect quite a deep power imbalance in the way that these kind of regimes operate, and that the CMA have very admirably started to speak about and consider as part of some of the reforms that are being considered. It has, I think, a chilling effect on regulators because they look daunted at the prospect of months in court and the huge cost, as others have mentioned, of kind of facing down some of those lobbyists and lawyers. So it seems to us new powers are needed, and as I say, the CMA have set out some very impressive proposals around that we support very strongly. It seems to us sector regulators like Ofcom in particular also need new powers as well. And the last point I'd make, I guess, particularly for this audience, is this is not for us about deserting competition. This is about making competition work better. So the insurance example I mentioned earlier is not a well-functioning competitive market. And the solutions that would solve that problem are not about abandoning competition, but about making it work better. And I would say the situation to avoid is the energy market situation, where the public lose faith, where the debate is politicised, where the government ends up intervening in ways that I don't think anyone particularly wanted. And so I think kind of maintaining that faith and legitimacy in the system is really important if the system is to survive in its current form, if you like. So really keen to work with the CMA on solving many of those big challenges, and really just trying to close that gap between the kind of lived reality of people interacting with these markets and debates like the one that we're having today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I have plenty of questions, but we're running a little behind, so I'm first going to ask you guys, the audience, if you would like to put your hand out, and please say who you are before you say your question. Yes, we'll go to the gentleman there. We've got a microphone coming as well.
Thank you very much. Andrew Lansley from the House of Lords. Can I pick up a point made by Professor Kovacic, which is about the international relationships? I mean, even in recent months, I've seen not only the CMA, but the FTC and the European Commission, and inside Europe, the French, the Germans, the Austrians, the Indians, beyond that, and Australia. They're all working on digital markets and the digital economy. Now, it seems, on the face of it, counterintuitive for global companies in global markets to be addressed by a series of fragmented national regimes. So if that leadership on the digital markets is to be given in the way that Professor Kovacic Bill, thank you, Bill, in the way you described, and if the CMA could help to initiate that, how is that to be done? In the context of, if the OECD is pursuing a digital services tax with national jurisdictions, is there scope for competition regimes to work collaboratively, especially if we're moving to more ex-ante regulation, not just ex-post interventions?
Sure. Go ahead. Trying to maybe answer briefly.
There's a major opportunity to achieve a better synthesis of what's taking place here. And I think there are things going on at the moment inside the CMA to seek cooperative relationships that would enhance that possibility. It can go two paths, one through the large multinational networks, and I see a greater emphasis taking place there, OECD, UNCTAD, ICN, but I think that we will see a greater cooperation among nations that are involved deeply, have the resources to do this work. And I think that one good thing I think is happening is that as these studies go on, it's an incremental process of learning rather than just walking over the same ground. But I see a lot of possibilities there to do considerably better, and the enhanced role that I see the CMA able to play, and I think interested in playing, would be a major spur to do that.
Did either of you want to?
So Andrea might want to.
So there is a lot going on. So there are basically two big networks. One is the OECD, as you mentioned. The other is called the International Competition Network. And we spend a lot of time within these two networks to coordinate. I think it's important to bear in mind it's the first time probably in history that you have genuinely global dominant companies. And it's the first time we're trying to coordinate on our side the action against that.
Yes. Microphone there if you want.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to Policy Exchange and all our speakers for the insights they've given us this morning. I think it's impossible to exaggerate the importance of what we've been hearing. The main reason why capitalism is, to put it mildly, underperforming is because competition is so imperfect. So my question is this. We've heard that the CMA have put forward some strong proposals for reform of the legislative framework within which they operate. Can Andrew give us some insight into how well or otherwise his dialogue with the government is going over the introduction of those reforms?
Well, Michael, it's work in progress, work in progress. There are several aspects. First of all, there's the consumer protection side, which has been in train for a long time and is at an advanced stage. And then there are wider reforms to the competition framework as a whole, to some of which I alluded. And incidentally, the duty of expedition I was talking about, we're hoping, if we can get imposed on us, will influence the speed, improve the speed of exactly the types of tackling exactly the types of detriment that you've heard, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, which has been dragging on for so many years at a cost to the NHS. I think it's fair to say that the new government is at great pace assembling further parts of its agenda right now in response to the commitments that they've already made and which were in the manifesto to ensure the delivery of them. Competition is one of them. The manifesto of the Conservative Party, in fact, I think all three major parties, if you can call Liberals a major party just now, refers directly to rip-offs and the need to find ways of addressing them. We've got a set of proposals. They're not the only way of dealing with it. We've got a set. But it is, of course, up to legislators. You're one, just down the corridor from where we work, there's 650 of them, to bring the pressure to bear to secure change if they agree with it. Our job is advocacy and to hand those
proposals to government and then ask them to consider them seriously. It's not our job to act irresponsibly by pressing them precipitately into change for which they're not ready. I think the case that you've heard from Bill, the one other point I make, the case that you've heard from Bill particularly entrenches the importance of us getting ahead with improving the quality of the competition framework in the UK, and the importance of grasping that the existing framework in the years ahead just won't do. It's got to be improved substantially in big ways, if not in the way we proposed. In other ways, we're very interested in listening to those. That crucial point still needs to be drummed in among some legislators, and then it's legislators' job to communicate that to government.
We've got time for a few more. We'll go here first.
Thank you. Scott Colvin from Finsbury. I'm just wondering whether you think this government is likely to be more interventionist on major M&A transactions in comparison to previous governments.
I mean, as you know, we're an independent agency, so government really has no impact on M&A transactions. So in that sense,
I'm not sure that always.
well, I mean, there is a separate angle, which is national security, which obviously is for government to think about legislation, and there are some proposals there. But in terms of the competition angle, seriously, I don't think this government or the previous government would make a difference for us in terms of the way we look at it.
I think it's fair to say at the moment you hear murmurs and rumours of discontent from time to time right across the political establishment. But I haven't heard, I specifically can give you an assurance that I haven't heard any proposal to compromise the independence of the merger regime.
Yes.
The CMA covers the whole economy, so you have a very wide range of opportunities to get stuck into. Lots of markets not working very well. How are you going to prioritise your work going forwards, and will you be using the full range of soft as well as hard powers?
That's absolutely the right question, and the answer has been partly given by an Andrea in his speech. We are, for example, going to, for the first time, try and measure levels of competition across the economy, which will give us markers for where detriment appears to be developing over time. We're also, I'll try and answer the question briefly, but there's so much to say. I'll do it as briefly as I can. On the soft power point, it is, I think, going to be crucial in dealing with these new forms of detriment that we get well beyond just working out whether we have some technical legal tool which over a run of years is going to secure the outcome we want. We're going to have to deploy a much wider range of tools, some of which may be regulatory, in order to, and also messaging to government to act more vigorously. Sometimes not only government, and I tried to make that point in my remarks, other institutions as well, including yours, to signal to them that we've got to get on with this work at a much greater pace. Andrew Lansley a moment ago referred to the need for more ex-ante intervention. That's absolutely right. The problem with these new forms of detriment, many of them, by the time the analogue system of competition and consumer protection policy has finally got itself fully underway, these forms of detriment have moved on a long way, and you are really chasing a shadow. So, and incidentally, one last point on it, the soft power is going to be dramatically more effective to the extent that we can eventually work with other competition authorities. There's a lot of work going on at the moment with a number of authorities around the world. We have taken the initiative as an authority in trying to find ways of working with them on specific areas of concern. Digital is right at the top of that list, both in the United States and elsewhere in the English-speaking world, and with the European Commission. Of course, there's a Brexit overhang there, which will complicate matters for a while. Hopefully we can get to a point where there is a much stronger consensus for how to go forward than there is at the moment, which will itself be a tool for soft power.
Okay, we can have one more if there's. It's a very, very brief question and a very brief answer. So,
Michael Dwyer, Daily Telegraph. You mentioned earlier about using your existing powers as well as reform, and you also mentioned increasing intervention in mergers potentially. Do you think that the CMA is likely to increase the amount of mergers that it blocks in the coming years, and has it been too slow to use that power in recent years?
I think on mergers we're always learning from experience. I think there is an impact on our caseload of people coming to us in very concentrated markets trying to push very difficult transactions, and so in many ways we react to whatever comes in. I think I would say there are a number of boards who feel reasonably bold in terms of some of the transactions they bring to us. And secondly, in the digital space, as you know, there have been hundreds of acquisitions by the large digital platforms over the years. Not a single one of them has ever been blocked by competition authorities. So there's been quite a lot of reflection globally by us, by the Federal Trade Commission and others about this. Because again, if you think about where we are today with Google or Facebook, maybe some of the acquisitions they have done over the years, with hindsight, we should have looked at them differently. So I think these are all factors that come into our assessment. So it's the same regime. We're applying it in the same way, but you have more transactions in concentrated markets and more transactions by digital platforms that probably worry us more than they would have 5-10 years ago.
thank you very much, everyone, and last round of applause for our panel. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. We're on the case.